My parents thought they could just give my paid-off car to my reckless brother and get away with it. They totally underestimated how far I'd go to get justice. And it all started with a 911 call that blew up our family forever. They figured that because they're my parents, they had some leftover right to my property. They thought wrong. And I was about to teach them, and my golden child brother, a lesson in ownership and consequences they would never, ever forget. Subscribe now for more emotional family drama stories. And tell me in the comments, would you call 911 if your own family crossed the line? My name is Aaliyah Carter, and for most of my life I've been labeled the responsible one. The kid who worked weekends, never asked for handouts, paid her own way. That reputation wasn't an accident. It was learned, necessity wearing patience into me like a well-worn coat. I learned early that if I wanted something I had to plan, grind, and protect it myself. My car, a 2025 Toyota Camry XSE, blacked out accents, sharp LED lights, wasn't flashy but it was mine. I can still remember the day I signed the papers, hands trembling, the title finally in my name. There was a small rush of triumph that felt like a private victory parade. 3 years of double shifts, selling the extra shifts on Saturdays, skipping happy hours and vacations so I could funnel every spare dollar into paying that balance down. When the last payment posted, I sat in my kitchen and cried good, tired tears. That title carried my sweat, my pride, and the sort of dignity you can't gift someone else. My brother Kevin, 2 years older, has never been that person. He's the kind who treats rules like recommendations. By 22, he'd already had 2 DUIs and a string of minor wrecks that never seemed to teach him anything. Mom and Dad used to joke about helping him learn, and then hand him cash like a Band-Aid on a recurring problem. They'd always seen him as the one who needed a little more time, while I was the one who had to prove myself. Again and again. The Tuesday everything went sideways started normal enough. I parked in my usual spot at the office, walked my 9 hours, dealt with the same small fires and clients who always needed a little more patience. When I stepped outside at 5, keys in my hand, I felt that little lift in my chest you get thinking about a quiet evening. Maybe take the long route home, stop by the grocery. Then my eyes scanned the row of cars and landed on an empty spot where mine should have been. At first, there was a flicker of confusion. Maybe I'd parked on the other side of the lot. Maybe the security guard had me towed for an expired sticker. But the sinking feeling came fast. It wasn't there. My phone slid out of my pocket, thumbs fumbling as I called my parents before I even fully felt the panic. Mom answered after 2 rings. For half a second, her voice was placid. Then the words she used felt slow and practiced. "Oh, honey, calm down. It wasn't stolen." "Not stolen?" I repeated, incredulous. "Then where is it?" She told me, like she was delivering the weather, that she and Dad had come by and taken the car. Kevin needed it for a job interview, they said. His car was out of commission and he'd promised this was his chance. "Family comes first," Mom said. "You can take the bus for a while," Dad added. Their voices had that tone parents use when they're trying to make something sound reasonable they know isn't. My stomach dropped through the floor. "Mom, the title's in my name. You don't get to just take it. I paid for it. It's just a car," she said. And in that sentence, they revealed everything I'd been living against. The assumption that my hard work was fungible, that my boundaries were negotiable, because we were family. I called Kevin. He picked up after a few rings, blaring music in the background, voice lazy and smug. "Hey sis, nice ride, huh? These seats are comfy. Where's my car?" I asked, and the words came out harder than I intended. "Oh, come on. Mom said it was cool. You know I need this shot. Don't be dramatic." That was the moment something in me snapped. All the small indignities, the times they excused him for missing rent because he's learning, the way Mom would drive him to interviews but expect me to use public transit, had piled up like unread mail. I could feel the same heat in my chest I'd felt when I held that title. Hot, steady, and not willing to be buried. I went back to the office to retrieve my paperwork, purchase receipts, registration, insurance, and then I called my parents again. Anger had given way to a cold, considered calm. If they could decide ownership by fiat, then I would make the law decide. This isn't about Kevin's job or helping him. I told Dad, voice steady. It's about property. The title's in my name. If you took it without my permission, that's theft. You don't have to make this a big deal, Mom said. It is a big deal, I said, because family doesn't give you the right to take what I worked for. The conversation escalated. Dad's voice grew louder, entitlement raw and unfiltered. He told me I was being selfish, that Kevin had earned the chance. I told him he was wrong and that legal definitions don't change because someone cries. Hanging up, I felt an odd clarity. I had spent my life navigating around other people's drama so I could keep what was mine. This time I wouldn't ask. I would act. I remember the walk back to the parking lot like a slow, cinematic montage. People were coming and going. The city kept moving. I didn't cry. Tears felt too performative, too much like begging. Instead, I dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and routine. 911, what is your emergency? I need to report a motor vehicle theft, I said, succinct. I gave the make, model, license plate. I gave names. Kevin's full name and the address I knew they lived at. I told them plainly, I did not give permission for anyone to use my car. There is a peculiar kind of silence that happens on the other end of a line when a family squabble becomes a criminal report. I could hear in the operator's soft clicks and typing, the way bureaucracy transforms domestic chaos into a layered problem that needs public resolution. 20 minutes later, the phone at my ear started ringing again. Mom's number, frantic. What did you do? The police are at the house. You're calling the cops on your brother? I stood there, hands on the hood of an older compact in the lot, the wind tugging at my jacket. I reported a theft, I said simply. You took my property. You refused to return it. If they'd expected me to fold in the face of family pressure, they were wrong. All those years of watching Mom and Dad rescue Kevin had taught me how to stop relying on their mercy. I'd been bound by their idea of what family meant. Now I was binding them to the law. When the officer called back a few minutes later and said they were dispatching a unit to retrieve the vehicle, the tightness in my chest loosened in a way I hadn't anticipated. The sight of truth being enforced, license plates checked, paperwork verified, felt like an exhale. Later that night, after the sirens and the handcuffs and Kevin's frantic calls, some part of the house fell silently away. My parents begged me to drop the charges, offering money, apologies, anything that would stitch the old picture back together. In the kitchen, I sat with my title in my lap and thought about everything that brought me there. The nights working double shifts after community college, the quiet afternoons at my thrift job where I learned to repair leather seats and spot good fabric, the final payment email that made me feel like I owned a small piece of independence. It wasn't only my car they'd touched. It was my boundary, my dignity, the thing that said my labor mattered. When Kevin's handcuffs clicked, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a complex mixture of relief and sorrow. This wasn't about revenge. It was about standards. You teach people how to treat you. Sometimes the lesson is a warning. Sometimes it's an unavoidable escalation. They tell you family is everything until the day family uses everything as an excuse to take from you. I learned then that family loyalty doesn't negate rights. Ownership still has a name on the title, and the law still has a language for unauthorized use. That night, I drove my Camry home from impound with the bill for fees and paperwork burning a small hole in my bag. I wrote the check and sent the receipt to my parents. I didn't say it out loud, but the message landed. Respect costs nothing, but it can be enforced. It changed things. It broke some things, too. Years of habitual forgiveness and expectations of leniency evaporated overnight. But I learned something essential. I could stand in my truth, protect what I'd worked for, and not apologize for it. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like my name meant something beyond who I'd been told to be. When my mother called back, sobbing and angry, the tone of her voice clarified everything. They were upset that I had involved the police, not that they'd taken what wasn't theirs. That part, the outrage at the method rather than the action, showed me who they were choosing to protect. Dad's reaction was classic. Loud, indignant, and baffled that his moral calculus didn't match mine. We were helping him, he said, as if that self-definition gave them blanket power to redistribute my property. Family, to them, meant privileges for Kevin and concessions for anyone who had done things the right way. When Officer Ramirez arrived at my workplace to take my statement, I walked through the sequence like a script I'd practiced in my head. Description of vehicle, recounting the calls and texts, the timeline. The officer was patient and professional. The facts were facts. That's what mattered. He typed notes, told me to expect a unit to go to my parents' address, and explained how unauthorized use and theft were defined under Illinois code. The language was clinical, but it felt like armor. I had a moment of reflection standing in that fluorescent parking lot with the city humming around me. I thought about the way my parents always framed their support for Kevin as help, almost proud of themselves for enabling him. They'd told me stories of his first little achievements and framed them like miracles they'd orchestrated. They painted themselves as the long-suffering heroes, but in reality, they'd been playing favorites with real consequences. Kevin's arrest that night was messy and immediate. He'd parked my Camry in their driveway like a trophy and argued his way into thinking permission had been granted retroactively. When the officer knocked, Kevin's bravado shattered into panic. I didn't feel triumph in that moment. I felt the cold clarity of a boundary enforced. The next morning was worse in a different way. My inbox filled with messages from family friends. Some called me heartless. One aunt said, "You're ruining this family." My extended family, it seemed, was not ready to hold two things at once: a love for Kevin and an acceptance that his actions have consequences. Mom called and begged. "If you drop the charges, we'll make it right. We'll pay for repairs, buy you a new car, anything. Please, we can't have Kevin have a felony. His life will be ruined." Her words were familiar. They had been used before to mop up problems. Quiet apologies followed by cash, lectures followed by bailouts. But this time I didn't want to be patched up with purchased contrition. I wanted what I had: my title, my sense of agency, and the knowledge that when someone crosses me, there is a line. When I told the DA's office I intended to cooperate fully, it didn't feel vengeful. It felt methodical. Legal repercussions exist, so that repeat patterns meet a hard stop. If Kevin avoided consequences because Mom and Dad cried and wrote checks, the pattern would continue. The next time it might be something worse than a car. That logic wasn't punitive. It was preventative. The family dynamic shifted after Kevin's night in the holding cell. They were forced to confront each other, the way enabling looks like love in the moment and like sabotage in the long run. For me, it opened a new space where I no longer had to be the quiet buffer for everyone else's drama. They either learned to respect my boundaries, or our relationship would change. Kevin pleaded with me the day after his arraignment. He was scared. He didn't like jail. It made everything too real. I told him the truth. I said, "I'm not trying to ruin you, Kev. I'm making sure you understand boundaries. You can't keep taking what's not yours." He cried in a way I'd never heard from him. Not petulant, but genuinely terrified. Parents tried to mediate, suggesting compromises. Dad called to say he'd take responsibility for the impound fees. Mom begged me to let her make it right. I accepted the money for the impound, because it was the practical thing to do. But I also sent an itemized bill that included a small line item labeled emotional labor. It was sardonic, but I wanted a record that charging me money for my own property came with a cost. Neighbors talked about it. Gossip is oxygen in our block. It fills lungs. It keeps stories alive. Some defended me. Some condemned me. People who had always admired me for my discipline publicly said, "Tough love." Others whispered that I'd gone too far. That's the trade-off when you flip your expectations. Some people prefer the fiction of family always being above the law. I found it harder than I expected to sleep. The cognitive dissonance of arising at dawn and going to work like nothing had happened, while your private life was unraveling in the courthouse, and on the phone with relatives took a toll. But it also felt honest. Before that day, I had often chosen to be the conciliator to preserve peace. Afterward, I found a deeper peace in standing firm. One moment cut through it all. The woman at the bus stop who'd watched the whole thing unfold said, "Good for you for holding firm. Sometimes people get too used to getting what they want." She didn't know the whole family story. She only saw a woman insisting upon dignity. Her words were a tiny, unexpected salve. When the DA's office arranged a plea deal for Kevin, no prison time but a felony on his record, fines, and probation, I felt complicated relief. The punishment wasn't the point, but the consequence was necessary. I'd never wanted to see him destroyed. I wanted him accountable. The plea allowed him to stay out of prison, for now, while still bearing the weight of choices. In the months after, I drove my Camry like it was an emblem of something more than transportation. It was a reminder that my efforts had tangible outcomes and that I didn't need to ask permission to keep what I built. My relationship with Mom and Dad changed. It didn't snap back. We navigated a new, quieter distance. They called less frequently, and when they did, conversations were more measured. It hurt sometimes, the small losses of intimacy you don't immediately notice. But it felt honest. Justice wasn't a one-time explosive event. It was a slow, legal unspooling of consequences paired with a personal realignment. I would not be the family doormat. If that made me appear cold to some relatives, that was their decision to judge. For me, the priority was clear. Respect your boundaries, or expect them to be enforced. And Kevin? A felony made the job market colder. He learned fast that sympathy doesn't equal employability. He had to reckon with the fact that consequences ripple. Maybe he grew, maybe he didn't. Either way, the boundary taught him a lesson he wouldn't learn from another bail check. Sitting in my Camry one evening with the engine humming and the city lights making the black paint glow, I thought of the small things I'd collected over the years. Receipts, not just of purchases but of choices. Each one told a story about who I was and what I valued. That night I decided one more thing. I'd never again trade my peace for someone else's convenience. I still remember the moment I decided to call 911 with a crystalline clarity. There's a split second before action where you consider consequences, second guess, weigh relationships against principle. That second stretched, then resolved. I dialed, saying the words, "I need to report a motor vehicle theft," into the receiver was less dramatic than I'd imagined. The operator's voice was procedural, calm. She asked for details, location, license plate, vehicle description. I told her everything, including the name of my brother and my parents' address. I said plainly, I did not give permission. There's a dissonant humility in turning family conflict into paperwork. You're trusting a system you didn't create to hold people accountable. For many people, law enforcement in our neighborhoods has its own history of complexity and distrust. Still, the law is a neutral reference. It says who owns what in terms that can't be overridden by favor. When the dispatcher said they were sending a unit, I felt a tension release, not because I wanted a show of authority, but because I needed a mechanism that made the choice between right and wrong visible and enforceable. At my parents' house, the officers were professional and direct. Kevin tried to plead, his voice riding that fragile border between bravado and panic. The cop asked to see registration. Kevin fumbled. There was no registration in his name. The officer explained the legal definition of unauthorized use and told Kevin he'd have to come with them if he refused to surrender the vehicle. The clinking sound of cuffs, which I'd never wanted to hear on anyone I loved, was grim and heavy. When Kevin was led away, Mom collapsed on the porch and sobbed, not from the wrongness of the act, but from the social embarrassment of police presence. Dad stood rigid, outraged at me for what he framed as calling the police on family. I sat quietly on the curb, hands in my lap, the title warm in my bag like a small talisman against the chaos. We all make choices in the wake of betrayal. Mine was simple. No more cover-ups, no more moving pieces. If boundaries meant unpopular decisions, I accepted that. The officers told me the car would be impounded and that I'd have to file a formal statement at the station. I did. I gave them the ownership documents and the chronology of calls. The official record exists for a reason. To make sure that when the world tried to blur lines for convenience, there was a durable truth to refer to. After Kevin's night in a cold cell, he had to face the reality of a felony charge. His lawyer negotiated a plea. He avoided prison, but carried the weight of a permanent mark on his record. It didn't feel like revenge to me. It felt like consequence. Sometimes mercy without accountability becomes harm in the long term. My parents tried every leverage to get me to drop the charges afterward, begging, bargaining, promising restitution. Mom cried over the phone. weaving remorse and indignation together like a tapestry she expected me to admire. But I'd reached a limit. This wasn't punishment as spectacle. It was the enforcement of a boundary that had been violated repeatedly. The simplest, most practical indignity was the impound fee. I paid it. I wrote the check and then sent the bill to my parents for reimbursement with an itemized list. Impound, time, emotional labor. The message read less like a bill and more like a statement. Your actions incurred costs. Accountability has a cost. Sometimes people are shocked to realize they must bear it. People asked me if I felt guilty. I didn't feel guilty for insisting on respect. I felt sorrow for the brokenness that let the situation escalate to police and arrests. There's a grief in recognizing a relationship's limits, a mourning for the illusion of unconditional reciprocity you once expected from family. The community's reaction surprised me. Some neighbors sided with me, offering quiet nods and approving smiles when they saw me drive by. Others scolded me as if my refusal to be exploited was a moral failing. That's the cost of flipping cultural expectations. You can be both praised and scorned for the same action, depending on which script someone prefers. Over time, distance settled in. I became low contact with parents who had previously set themselves up as arbiters of forgiveness. There were small moments that felt like currency. A holiday text begrudgingly sent, a voicemail asking if I was okay. I responded minimally. My energy had been spent on doing the necessary work. The long little details matter. Filing the statement with the DA meant meetings where I recounted moments I'd rather forget. Excuses offered for Kevin's behavior, the casual dismissal of my ownership. Sitting across from a prosecutor, I felt a strange steadiness. Those documents and official statements make the world legible. You can't gaslight a court record with an appeal to sentiment. Kevin's plea deal carried consequences he'd have to live with. Fines, probation, the social cost of a criminal record and job applications. I watched him navigate the aftermath like someone learning to walk through mud. There was shame, and sometimes an odd appreciation that this form of accountability may be the only thing that would force real change. Months later, on a quiet evening, I sat in my Camry after an especially long day. The city lights reflected off the dashboard, and the seat felt familiar, like a steady anchor. I rolled the windows down and let lakeshore wind wash through the car. For a moment, I allowed the small pleasure of autonomy to settle in. Ownership isn't only about property. It's about the right to define what you will not surrender. I don't tell the story to cast myself as heroic. I tell it because sometimes dignity requires laws to be enforced when compassion has been misapplied as permission. You teach people how to treat you. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I chose to teach it back. When family relationships strained into quiet distance, I mourned them. But standing in the light of my choices, I knew I had done what I needed to do. I'd kept my name on the title, and kept my life on terms I had earned. That felt worth the price.